Hi BookTube, and welcome to another fiction review. I did finish today's novel. However, I've got to say that at several points I was very tempted, more tempted than I think I have been in a long time, not to finish. And for that reason, I'm going to issue a disclaimer before this review starts. Obviously, I'm going to try my hardest to distinguish between personal reactions so that they don't come across as pronouncements, but just as preferences. I did search on Google and also on YouTube to try to find a positive review of this book that I could put in my description box so you could get a second and third opinion. But the truth is, I wasn't able to find any lengthy review that didn't have some reservations, and a lot of those reservations were similar to my own. So make of that what you will. Today we're reviewing The Dante Club by Matthew Pearl. It was published in 2004. It's 367 pages, and you can see my Amazon prices on the date of review, so it's still a reasonably priced book, but easy to get cheaply online, at least in the UK. And this was historical crime fiction. It has a mystery to it, and there's a dash of dark academia. I know that's going to appeal to a lot of you as a premise, and I'm going to talk more about the premise of the book and why I did think it was a great idea. I read the paperback version, and this one qualifies as book 11 of 18 of my winning titles. So now you know I bought it kind of sight unseen because I found the title really drawing. And before we go into the review proper, let's just have a bit of information about our author, Matthew Pearl. He was born in 1975 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He went to Harvard, and of course that put him in Boston and gave him the ideal background to do research on historical Boston, because this novel is set in 1865 in that city. And it was his debut novel, The Dante Club. His latest work in 2025 is Save Our Souls, and that is a piece of narrative nonfiction. Right, now we will look at different aspects of this novel, beginning with its setting. And the novel is set in Boston, as I said, in 1865, and the action is happening in several different locations around the city. Now, my paperback version came with one illustration, a black and white reproduction of a 15th century painting by Bartolomeo di Fruosino, depicting the different levels of hell that Dante writes about. Speaking personally, I found that several times during my reading, I was wishing that the book included a map of Boston circa 1865. And that was partly because I felt a map would help me understand where the various locations were in relation to each other, where the main characters lived in relation to those locations, in particular in relation to the university campus, and also some idea of the socioeconomic geography. Where did wealthy people live? Where did poor people live? Where did Black Bostonians live? Because that played a part in this novel. The setting in terms of time, I mentioned again, it was 1865, so we know the Civil War has just ended, and the characters talk about the assassination of President Lincoln, and it's clear from the way they talk about their concern that the event happened quite recently. I went back and reread the first 30 pages of the novel, trying to get my place in time more exactly. I could tell there was one scene where a character was lecturing students at Harvard, and then also early on in the book, there is an incident which demands that a body without clothing would be able to survive outdoors for 2 or 3 days, so it couldn't be too cold. The end of the novel describes clearly winter weather, and the lapse of time does seem to be only a couple of months, 2-3 months. So I'm conjecturing, with all that information in mind, that the novel takes place somewhere between September and early September 1865 and ends before Christmas of that year. Of course, we can't talk about the setting without mentioning hell. Now, hell is not, of course, a real location in this novel. However, for many characters, the existence of hell is real, and those characters are worried about the implications of translating from Italian into English about what the devil does for a living. And for other characters, hell has been relocated by their experience of war. For many fighting men, they were left with a spiritual dislocation after the conflict ended, and particularly those who returned to Boston, which had been largely unaffected by the fighting. And I will say that it was this aspect of the setting, that is, the reaction of fighting men coming back from the Civil War, which I felt could have been integrated and developed by Matthew Pearl differently, but I'm going to say more about that later. Let's talk now about narrative viewpoint. It is third person and omniscient, and you know how sometimes that means you get behind the eyes of particular characters. In this novel, the focus changes often. That is, you find yourself behind one character's eyes, then behind another, then behind another, and it does chop and change quite quickly. And it seemed to me that this moving about very quickly, what it did was made the narrator's voice very noticeable. And it seemed to me that Matthew Pearl, in choosing his words and also choosing how he structured his sentences, it seemed he was attempting to create a voice that was somehow memorable, a little bit different, possibly trying to create a 19th century voice. I'm not sure of which of those is true. I would need to read another book written by him to be certain. But the narrative voice in this novel, I have to say, left a stronger impression with me than the voices of any particular character. Now, regarding the number of characters, there is a lot. There's between 25 and 35, I would say. A lot of these play minor or bit parts in the novel. The focus for almost all of the book, up until about page 336, is on four famous American men of letters: the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Oliver Wendell Holmes, James Russell Lowell, and the historian George Washington Green. In real life, these four men met together at Longfellow's house in the year 1865 to assist Longfellow with the first American translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, and that was actually published in 1867. Matthew Pearl is taking those historical characters and this episode in their lives, and he's imagining a murder mystery which is linked closely to Dante's visions of the tortures of the damned in hell. And it's murders that these men, they cannot ignore, even though they would prefer to. We need to talk about representation in this novel, representation of gender and of race. By my count, I got 9 female characters in the novel. Most of them are bit players who appear very, very briefly. A couple of them have a function, that is, they introduce a tidbit of knowledge which assists in the discovery of the novel's mystery. A couple seem to be needed only to worry about their menfolk, to appear for a paragraph or two. And I want to say that I was disappointed with the way Matthew Pearl chose to write Lowell's daughter Mabel, whose appearances made it seem as though she might play a significant part in events, but by the end of the book that turned out not to be true at all. Given the number of famous and socially active Bostonian women in the late 18th and early 19th century, I was disappointed that the book didn't have one female character who was well drawn and played some kind of active, even if minor, active role in the unfolding of events. And we need to talk about race. Okay, Google tells me that the first Black law officer in the United States served as the Deputy U.S. Marshal in Oklahoma Indian Territory, and he was appointed in 1875. Matthew Pearl chooses to change history slightly, go back a decade, and portray a mixed-race police officer in the Boston force in 1865. The character is Nicholas Ray. He's dark-skinned enough for his racial difference to be noticed and commented upon by both white and black characters. Now, I assume that Matthew Pearl took this decision to augment history because he wanted to tell the story of Nicholas Ray, that Ray's identity and his personal story would be a meaningful inclusion to the novel. And Ray does make a lot of appearances in the story. In fact, he seems to do the bulk of police legwork when it comes time to investigate the murders which happen in the story. In Chapter 8, there is a single scene portraying Ray outside working hours, taking us briefly into that part of Boston where black citizens resided. We're told that Ray no longer has a comfortable relationship either with white people or with the black citizens of Boston because he is now a police officer. And it's just a few sentences, so I'm going to read them. And this is from page 119 of the novel. Hordes of black people were coming and going on the public horse cars. Young ladies, laundresses, and household servants whose hair was caught up loudly in colored handkerchiefs, whose dangling jewelry made brash music. A black soldier or sailor in uniform might be seen, still a jarring sight. So too was a certain mulatto walking with notable poise along the streets, ignored by some, laughed at by others, glared at by the more wizened blacks, who in their wisdom knew that Ray was a policeman and thus unlike them in that regard as well as in his mixed race. Blacks had been safe in Boston, were even permitted schooling and public transportation alongside whites, and therefore they kept quiet. Ray, however, would stir up hatred if he made a wrong move or crossed the wrong person in his duties. The blacks had exiled him from their world for those reasons, and because these reasons were right, no explanation or regret was ever delivered to him. If Ray has any backstory, any family or former friends, we're not told anything about that. Apart from this section that I've just read, we don't hear anything about Black Boston at all. There's no more time spent in Ray's head except when he happens to be thinking about the cases that he's working on. So by the end of the book, he's much the same person as he was at the beginning, and because of this, I really didn't understand why Pearl felt compelled to create him, when as far as I could see, Ray could have been written as a white patrolman, and the novel would have run in much the same way as it did, and nothing would have changed significantly. There's no thematic examination of race that demands that the novel have a character like Ray, whose story gets fully told. I hate to use the word token, but I honestly could not think of any other reason why a black character was invented for this book. We'll talk also about problematic content. Most of the reader's time in this novel is going to be spent with patrician characters, wealthy people of Boston. And so that's going to give the novel a bit of a cozy feel. The murders, however, are inspired by Dante's descriptions of how the damned are tortured in hell, and those murders copy those tortures in detail. Now, the readers are never asked to be present when anyone is killed. However, they are given detailed retellings, in some cases by medical personnel, about how they must have died. At the end of the novel, there is also a chapter that retells the life of a soldier and how he spent the Civil War. And of course, that contains details of deprivation, of injury, of abuses of women. Again, it's a quick retelling, so you might get a sentence or two mentioning these things. It is a necessary detail to understand the motivations of one particular character. Okay, rabbit hole time when we get down to details. I might as well face the camera and say exactly which aspects of this novel tempted me to stop reading. The Dante Club did something that very few books do to me. It actually made me get out a red pen, literally, this red pen here, right? And mark the book like an editor and wish that the manuscript could undergo one more rewrite. The story concept that there are murders happening in 1865 Boston that happen to mimic exactly the tortures in Dante's The Divine Comedy, when that book has not been translated into an American version yet, but it is undergoing translation, and at the very moment that the tortures are being translated, the same tortures are being mimicked in Killings. This is a brilliant premise, absolutely brilliant premise. So what I'm saying is it's the execution of the premise that didn't feel ready for publication. This book, when I read it, felt like a manuscript, a draft that still needed more work done. And so page after page, that made the reading extremely frustrating. I actually wish that I could rewrite the manuscript. I did. It's the same feeling that people get that causes them to write fan fiction sometimes. Sometimes you write fan fiction because you read a book or you watch a film and you think, no, that's not quite it. Oh, that's not quite it, but it's so close. That was how I felt about the Dante Club. And I'm going to talk in detail now about aspects which in particular bothered me. And for that, I'm going to probably be reading my notes. So if I'm not looking at the camera in the way I love to train myself to do, it's because I want to give you these details verbatim. So first of all, there's a language issue. One of the reviewers on the back cover of my paperback copy called Matthew's writing erudite. Now, I don't know if That was a euphemism. When I read the review in the Guardian newspaper written by Stephanie Merritt, she said this about the Dante Club. She said, Pearl wants his prose to sound like a 19th century novel, and it is consequently overwrought at times. Now, that's how I felt. It stood out for me that sometimes in trying so hard to have this original narrative voice, possibly a 19th century one, I feel like Matthew just missed the mark sometimes in places and came up with very odd, awkward word images. And I'm going to give you some examples now. On page 5, there's a quote, "A terrible scream cleaved the air. It belched forth in light echoes from the house's dozen chimneys." And I thought, belch it? A scream belching? No. Page 47. "Her two sons sat slumped on armchairs, flanking the door like two granite bulldogs." And again, I thought that was a strange association of slumping bodies being associated with figures carved out of granite, which would be more stiff and formal. I don't know. That was just one of those things I thought, no, change that slightly. Page 119, talking, and this is where I read it out loud, talking about the black women's dangling jewelry making brash music. And I thought, no, it wouldn't. You would hardly hear it. In fact, if you would hear anything at all, because the only thing that might be dangling, they might wear earrings. I'm not even sure if they would in 1865 Boston. I actually wanted to know how much jewelry would women have been able to afford and wear. And even if they did, how much would it clash with anything to make any kind of noise at all? Again, I thought it wasn't a well thought out image. Page 204. Dr. Manning dropped his conversation with Hill. He revolved, so his marble white beard faced the mulatto officer. And I thought, revolved? People don't revolve, they turn. Mechanisms revolve. Again, it was just one of those words. Page 333, Field's knees bent inward. And I thought, well, that's not physically possible without causing serious damage, and that's not actually what's happening. What he might have said was his knees buckled. He felt his knees go a bit shaky and weak, but they don't bent inwards. I think, again, they're just little red penning things. Page 305. Manning passed his hand over the bare ravine between his two cresting tufts of white hair. And this exact image was also used on page 13. Manning removed his hat and passed a hand over the bare ravine between waves of frothy hair that crashed down from either side of his head. I couldn't imagine a bald head between tufts of hair being described as a ravine. A ravine to me is much narrower and more V-shaped. The top of a bald head is round, and it just I wanted to use a different word. Also, the word about hair crashing. Matthew Pearl uses the word crash to describe things that are too lightweight to crash. Hair, he certainly does that a couple of times. A wet face cloth, he talks about it crashing to the bed. I thought, no, it won't crash. And these are just awkward uses of words that I just wanted to go pick a different word. That's standing out too much. So language was a big issue for me. And another issue was historical inaccuracies or historical improbabilities, the number of. If there's one or two, you usually forgive them, but there were quite a few. I'm going to name the ones that I spotted. On the opening page, we are in the parlor of a very important house, and we find that there are two female servants sitting on one of the sofas with a policeman sitting between them. Now, first of all, in a house with a parlor, in the UK, a gentleman would have chosen a different seat. He would not have sat close by any females in the same room. Also, servants, unless they behave very differently in 19th century America than they did in 19th century England, servants would never have sat on the furniture in a good room without permission from the owner, or they would not have remained in the room unless they were required there to be doing their duties. And the head of police in Boston is referred to by his colleagues as chief. Chief, they were always saying. And again, I felt that was not correct mid-19th century parlance. I could be wrong on that, but I felt very strongly that no, that is a 20th century parlance being dragged back into the 19th century. There's a book burning, which apparently did take place at Harvard in 1865. And there's a historical personage who's present at that burning who definitely was not in the United States at the time. And I got that from a reviewer of the book online. The murderer also has, we find, a peculiar habit of tearing out tiny, tiny pieces from books, literally only the size of a single letter or two letters, and then he likes to chew on these pieces of paper and spit them out. Now, these pieces of paper apparently are still legible enough to investigators for them to identify the letter. And I didn't find that plausible at all. Now, the character of Nicholas Ray, you'll remember this is the mixed-race police officer. He doesn't know any Italian. However, he's able to keep in memory, without being able to write it down correctly, a whole phrase in Italian that is whispered to him once by a suspect, and then he's able to recognize it when he hears that phrase repeated several weeks later, even though he and the speaker of the phrase are on opposite sides of a closed door. And again, I felt, no, that is pushing luck. I can't believe that he would be able to remember a phrase in a language he does not understand and therefore cannot correctly spell. He does write it down on a piece of paper, but he writes it down phonetically, and he gives that piece of paper to someone else, so he doesn't even have it on his person at the time he rehears the phrase. So again, it just doesn't hold up very well. And the physical description of the murderer after he's discovered is very different than the description we get of that character earlier in the novel when he's first identified. And it's to a degree that I think unfairly misleads the reader, because I think otherwise the reader might have identified the killer correctly before the end of the book. The other difficulty I had to do with structure and viewpoint. I mentioned how frequently viewpoint changes. Scattered and meandering and badly constructed were the words that online reviewers used to talk about the structure of this book on Storygraph and GoodReads. And if you ask the question, whose story is this about the Dante Club, you really can't come up with a single answer. There are viewpoint scenes given to so many different characters, and the viewpoint changes so often that you feel lost. You don't really know who's important, who you should be getting behind, who's going to be doing the principal action. And viewpoint focus might have been less important if what Matthew Pearl aimed to write was a literary novel just examining the experience of translating Dante in 19th century Boston and the social opposition that was coming from Harvard and maybe other aspects of reaction from the community at large. But because this book is attempting to be a murder mystery, I think readers will be expecting greater plotting and greater structure, and there's also pacing expectations and that frequent jumping from character to character, which made a lot of character introductions without furthering the plot. Now that took the first 100 pages, and I can understand why some reviewers, online reviewers, did say it was a very slow beginning, and that's because we just weren't focused on anybody. We were introducing lots and lots and lots of people, then a murder, then a this, then a that, and not really settling down. It needed reordering. Online reviewers also mentioned how confusing the viewpoint transitions were because there was no textual indication that it was happening, like an additional space or some kind of dividing marker or even a paragraph or a chapter break to signal a change. You would literally get a change of viewpoint within the same paragraph in many instances, and it would be very confusing. It would take you a few lines to realize, wait a minute, I'm not with the same person. And to go back a couple of sentences, go, okay, so there must be where the new character's viewpoint came in. Okay, except they weren't named. They just continued to use the pronoun he. That doesn't really help. Or something similar. They might use the other character's name, but it just became very confusing to tell, okay, who am I with now? And I think, again, that needed tidying up, editorial tidying up. Character movement was not often described as well. That is, character A might be described as being in one location, then the viewpoint would switch to character B, who was in a different location, and then as you follow character B, suddenly there's character A also, doing something or speaking, and yet there was no description of how they approached or got to this new location. Again, just another one of those little things that needed tidying up. And I've already talked about poor representation when it came to gender, female characters, and race, black characters, of Nicholas Ray's character. But I think also there was poor representation of Civil War veterans. And that's a big problem because the soldiers' experience of war and aftermath, that is critical thematically and critical to the murder mystery plot. Both Longfellow and Holmes have sons who went to war and they came back changed. And both older men ruminate on this, but we don't get significant viewpoint time with the sons. We don't get any of their fighting backstory. When we reach the climax of the novel and the killer is finally identified but not yet caught, the narrative just suddenly interrupts for an entire chapter to give us this backstory all in one go. And this information was necessary, but its placement, in my opinion, was a big structural mistake because it interrupts the story tension just before the highest point. And in a crime novel, that is a crime in itself, right? It subjects the reader to a sudden info dump of backstory, which, because it's an interruption, you just lose dramatic effect. And I'm sure that's what Matthew Pearl wanted, was dramatic effect. I think his intention was to build reader identification and sympathy with the psychology of this character who up to this point has only played a small role in the book. But I just think the effect on the way he chose to introduce that information finally, it just caused frustration. I found that I wasn't interested in it by the time I got it. I thought, no, I should have known this beforehand. This should have been built up slowly and introduced to me gradually. So by the time I realize who the murderer is, I already have his backstory and I'm emotionally identifying with him at that point of highest tension in the book. And I'm going to go further than just talk about what I liked and disliked. I'm going to talk about how I feel the book could be rewritten to structure it better. Okay, I think what we should do is reduce the number of viewpoint characters drastically and focus mainly on the viewpoint of Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes and his son, Captain Wendell Holmes. Why? Because both the older and the younger Holmes are conflicted characters, and conflicted characters are always the most interesting. Other characters didn't show the same level of internal conflict. Longfellow a little bit, but I think Longfellow could be a viewpoint character, just not so often. Also, both older and younger Holmeses move in different social circles so that one may know something that the other does not. That would help with structuring the mystery of it all. Holmes Sr. has a literary side. He is a poet, and that connects him to the Dante Club and everything that's going on there. Whereas Holmes Jr. is a decorated Civil War veteran. And since the story is using the plight of veterans as a strong plot point, I think more time should have been spent with Holmes Jr. We should have been introduced to more of his background, and maybe that background could have tied in with the background of the murder suspect in a way that would have revealed the murder suspect's backstory without revealing who they were. That could have been done, and it would have helped because it would have tied in. It could have all come from Wendell Holmes Jr.'s viewpoint. Also, Holmes Sr. has a medical qualification that allows him to act as a coroner, which he does on a few occasions. So that connects him to the police who are actively trying to solve the crime, because you will need at least one police character with some viewpoint time. Not as many as there were, and I don't believe there was any advantage to creating a black police officer, because we weren't really looking at race in this book at all. He was simply put in, but really you could have created any character to do the work he did, and I would have believed in them just the same. Right, everybody, that is the review done. It took longer. I'll probably have to call it a sideline because I shared so much of my own opinions, but I felt it was important that you understand what I found difficult about the story and give you details of that, because I think those details are important. I think they help you make your own decision. I will probably try to read another Matthew Pearl, and I know that sounds like some kind of torture imposed upon myself, but it's important for me to understand, was it just this book? Would I feel that one of his later works, for example, does he learn some polish? Do editors have words with him and go, do you know what? The reviews of the Dante Club, they weren't so great, so let's try making some changes. If I find that a later book shows a change, then I would like to review it so that you can understand exactly whether his writing has improved since then or undergone some changes, and that might help you with choosing whether or not to read another one of his works. There will be links in my description box to GoodReads reviews, Storygraph reviews, also to a Guardian review, and to a link to that one historical inaccuracy where the author talks about it in more detail because they know than I do. I feel I should share something so you can get other opinions, so that you don't just think, oh, my opinion necessarily counts for much. Check out other people's, because there were some people who loved this book, but I think the reviews were quite mixed. I think the average GoodReads rating was 3.5 stars. So not a lot of 4 or 5 star ratings for the book. So I felt that it was worth going into detail to say why that might be. Okay, everybody, I hope your reading is going well. Mine is certainly going better now that I'm reading different books. And until I see you again in a few days' time, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.